Amanda Fullerton's father, Eddie, a Sinn Féin councillor, was assassinated by British agents 16 years ago.
Less than 2 years ago, Republicans were fighting police in Belfast, a despised enemy they saw as the armed face of British oppression.
Sinn Féin have done more than any other party to take the gun out of Irish politics.
At the moment, one of those big issues is the possible imminent collapse of the Northern Ireland political process.
This is now the start of a completely different future for people in Northern Ireland. That will have power sharing on the 26th of March. And if it doesn't, that's over. That process is over.
I, as leader of the largest unionist party, will be setting the stage for this election, and you'll just have to wait and see what it'll be.
"38 years have passed since the beginning of what would come to be known as the Troubles. The year 1969 brought the British Army to the streets of Northern Ireland as violence between Catholic Republicans and Protestant Loyalists spiraled out of control. For the next 3 decades, sectarian violence raged and more than 3,600 people would lose their lives. While Northern Ireland remains a divided society, the healing process has begun thanks to the tireless efforts of activists from both communities who work daily to make reconciliation and social transformation a reality. Cross-community activists agree that a peaceful future is within reach. They also agree that it will take several generations for the fear and hatred to dissolve. If the two sides continue to come together, to share experiences, to acknowledge differences and embrace common ground, future generations will know peace. After 6 years of British government direct rule, the British and Irish governments have set March 26, 2007 as a deadline for a return to a devolved, power-sharing government. Many in Northern Ireland are cautiously optimistic that their politicians will find a way to work together to address the many local issues that affect daily life, while offering support and leadership to those members of both communities who have devoted their lives to peace building. George Mitchell served as the Democratic Senator from Maine from 1980 to 1995. In 1996, the British and Irish governments asked Senator Mitchell to serve as chairperson of the Northern Ireland peace negotiations. The process took 2 years and culminated in the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which was a major step forward in the peace process and ended decades of violent conflict. In May of 1998, this historic agreement was overwhelmingly endorsed by voters in Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Yet 9 years after its passage, the Good Friday Agreement is far from being fully implemented. I recently spoke with Senator Mitchell and asked him his thoughts on the causes of the conflict, the need for power sharing, and what lessons can be learned from the Northern Ireland peace process. Senator Mitchell, can you help us to understand the basis for the conflict in Northern Ireland? It's so often characterized as a religious conflict, but would you agree that it's more complicated than that?
The conflict in Northern Ireland has many causes and deep roots. It's partly religious, although certainly not entirely as depicted by some. It's partly national identity. The Unionist majority, largely Protestant, identifies with the United Kingdom, of which Northern Ireland is a part. The nationalist minority, largely Catholic, identifies with Ireland. It's also territorial. It's a relatively small place in terms of land area. And there are also, as in all such conflicts, economic factors. Indeed, I think the most common element in all the conflicts which I've been involved in Bosnia, in the Middle East, and in Northern Ireland, are the economic factors. So it's many things to many different people, and it is certainly not just religion.
While progress has been made since the passage of the Good Friday Agreement, Northern Ireland still remains an extremely segregated society. There are still many members from both communities who would not dare step foot into the other's territory. Yet a power-sharing assembly is set to resume next week. Is it reasonable to expect that power sharing is possible in such a deeply divided society?
Well, in fact, it is the very divisions to which you refer that make a power-sharing government essential. The normal principles of democratic governance can't operate effectively in a society as deeply and sharply divided as Northern Ireland or in other places. The very purpose of power sharing is to guarantee some degree of authority for the minority, because it would be impossible to expect the government to come together, given the history and given the division that they have. It's also not unusual to have bad feelings linger for quite a while after conflict. Remember, this has been going on in one form or another on the island of Ireland for 800 years, and very deeply felt emotions, very strongly held views are the consequence. You can rebuild buildings that have been bombed, you can replace burned-out motor vehicles fairly quickly, but to change what's in people's hearts and minds, which is the most important thing of all, usually takes a long time, generations, and that's what it will take in Northern Ireland. But if you don't have self-governance, if you don't have power sharing, if you don't have some degree of progress on full implementation of the agreement, you increase the risk of a reversion to the kind of conflict that has plagued Northern Ireland for such a long time.
On my recent trip to Belfast, I talked with members from several different cross-community organizations who have been working very hard to keep the peace process moving forward. But they all agreed that a local power-sharing government is crucial to maintaining the progress that they have made. In other words, they all agreed that it's time for the political process to catch up with the peace process. What are your thoughts on that?
It's pretty obvious that there would not have been a Good Friday Agreement, nor the degree of progress that's been made in reducing conflict, but for the efforts of so many people in both communities trying to reach across the divide and to work cooperatively on a number of issues, all of them dedicated to reconciliation and to an ending the kind of violence and the strong attitudes that fueled the violence that existed for such a long period of time. And what they told you is really just another way of saying that the public is ahead of the politicians. The public wants to move on. They've had enough of this violence. They want a more normal life. It is the desire for personal and physical security and for some degree of normalcy in life that I think was a large contributing factor to bringing about the end of conflict. And that's a huge positive that can't be overlooked. There's very little cross-community violence now. There's still a lot of violence, but it tends to be internal to each community. That's unacceptable, but it's not the same way that it was when you had this widespread sectarian conflict going on and large numbers of people being killed. So my view is that the politicians have to take this last step, because otherwise they leave open and perhaps increase the possibility that there's going to be a resumption of conflict. And one of the stark lessons of history is that at each stage of this conflict, when it's been resumed, it has been more harsh, more violent, more destructive than the previous phase. That follows, obviously, from advancements in weaponry and killing. We don't like to think much about this or talk much about this, but the area of human activity that advances most rapidly in an era of technological change is the ability to kill other human beings. And so now you have more dangerous weapons that can be assembled from ingredients that are available to the general public. You don't need large armies. You don't need large numbers of people. You don't need large sums of money. And it's risky and dangerous to keep this process uncertain and in limbo and create the possibility of a single violent incident, a terrorist act, that could plunge all the people there back into the conflict that existed before. That's why it's so important that the political leaders take action now.
Several of these community activists that I spoke with were former combatants from both sides of the conflict who now work tirelessly for peace. I know that ex-combatants also played a role in the peace negotiations which you chaired. Can you speak a bit about this transformation and the crucial role that ex-combatants have played in the peace process?
It's a remarkable story in and of itself, the extent to which people who've led lives of violence, some of them have killed, some of them have themselves have been injured, all of them engaged in a horrific level of violence over a long period of time, that have come through and come out of the process committed to ending the violence and bringing about a peaceful resolution of the conflict and differences to be settled peacefully in the future. And it does really inspire and renew one's faith in the power of redemption to see people who've committed such evil acts now devoted to preventing others from doing what they did. It's a hopeful sign. It's a good sign, and it's also good that it happens to people on both sides, so that it isn't just one group doing it. It's really pretty much both groups or every level of participation.
So what comparisons can we make between the U.S. involvement in Northern Ireland and our other attempts at conflict resolution elsewhere in the world?
Well, our approach obviously was tailored to the circumstance which exists there. The reason every president prior to Bill Clinton stayed away from Northern Ireland is because it was thought to be a political loser. On the one side, you had the British, our mother country, our staunch allies. On the other, you had the Irish, a source of heritage and citizenship for very large numbers of Americans. There's an estimated 30 million Americans of Irish heritage. And no president wanted to get involved in that. Clinton, to his credit, was the first one to plunge into it and get involved. And he asked me to go, and then the British and Irish governments asked me to stay and conduct the negotiations. So it's very different from our situation elsewhere. The second is that this is a good example of where I think the United States can be helpful without the use of military force or without spending billions of dollars. We fired not a single shot at Northern Ireland. We remained very true to our ideals. We did not try to impose our answers on them. In fact, on the very first day of the negotiations, I made it clear that I told them there's no U.S. plan, there's no Clinton plan, there's no Mitchell plan. Any solution that comes out of these discussions will be your solution. It's your country, your issue. It's got to be your solution and your agreement.
So what do you consider the universal principles of conflict resolution, and what lessons can be learned from the Northern Ireland peace process?
First, there's no such thing as a conflict that can't be ended. Conflicts are created and conducted by human beings. They can be ended by human beings. It's very important to establish that principle because, secondly, you need public support for any resolution, particularly in democratic societies, and public support can be developed only if there develops a sense of hope and the possibility of resolving the problem. As one elderly woman who looked like everybody's favorite grandmother said to me, we've been killing each other for centuries and we're doomed to go on killing each other for more centuries. Well, I work hard to reverse that, and I encourage the political leaders to create a sense of optimism and hope, not a foolish and unrealistic sense, but the possibility that something could be done about this. Third, you have to get a reduction in violence and a reduction in the emotion that flows from violence to give political leaders the opportunity to take the steps needed to reach agreement. It's very hard when you have a big publicized, emotional funeral at which there are demands for revenge every weekend, for a political leader then to go in and make a compromise next week when all of his constituents don't want compromise, they want revenge. So that's why it was essential at first to bring about ceasefires and to bring down the level of violence. Fourth, it was absolutely essential that there be demonstrated commitment and perseverance from the outset. The first day I was there, I said to them, I'm here to stay until we finish. I'm not leaving. And there were bombs, there were assassinations, there were murders. Through it all, we stayed with the process. Now, on some days, we literally couldn't meet. They would not come to meetings. So I went to them. I went to individual offices just to say that the process was going. In fact, it became kind of a ritual that every time a bomb would go off or there'd be a high-profile assassination, the governments and the parties would ask me to hold a press conference to confirm that the process would continue. You've got to make it clear we're going to stay here until we get the job done. The fifth and final factor is the importance of economic growth and job creation. Where you have no opportunity, few jobs, no hope, there you have the ingredients for instability and violence, whether it's in Northern Ireland or Gaza or the Balkans or any big city in the United States. People need hope. They need income to support themselves and their families, and men and women need work to establish some sense of meaning in their lives. And where that doesn't exist, people are much more likely and prone to fall prey to those who would use violence to achieve their objectives. When a fellow's got a job, he's got a mortgage, he's got kids in school, he's busy, then he's much less likely to get involved in political or other forms of violence. So those are principles that I think apply everywhere. Most peace negotiations focus on security and political issues. You have to. But I think they should focus equally on economic growth and job creation, because you can't have sustainable peace unless you have economic growth, job creation, and the creation of hope and opportunity for people.
This is Indie Media On Air on KPFK, 90.7 FM Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara.
Jerry McConville spent 8 years in Long Kesh Prison for his involvement with the IRA. Released at the age of 24, Jerry emerged from prison just as committed to Republican principles, but with a matured perspective and a new vision for his role in the Republican movement. He resolved to continue the struggle for civil rights and ultimately a united Ireland through community development work, and has spent the past 20 years working as a community activist in West Belfast. Jerry McConville is one of many ex-prisoners from both communities who have come to believe that a non-violent resolution to the conflict between nationalists and unionists is not only possible but necessary, and their passion, commitment, and leadership continues to play a crucial role in the Northern Ireland peace process. Jerry is now the director of the Falls Community Council, which provides support and advocacy programs to the Catholic community and is at the forefront of conflict resolution and peace-building efforts throughout the city of Belfast. We will now hear from Jerry McConville as he discusses the need for a local power-sharing assembly and his vision for a united Ireland.
I became involved with the Republican movement, and in 1976, when I was 16 years of age, I went to prison. Served my time mostly on the blanket during the H-Block protest. In 1984, when I came out, I became re-involved in the struggle, but this time mostly through community development work in the area. And I work for a number of organisations, and I'm currently with Falls Community Council, of which I'm director. Falls Community Council was an organisation that was started in the mid-70s, about 1974, back in those days, the Catholic community especially had no connection with the state, and therefore was totally detached, and anything that really happened in the areas, people made it happen themselves, so they did for themselves. So for example, if young people needed a youth club, it was generally the people of the area who set the youth club up and run it themselves with volunteers. Falls Community Council started up as basically saying, well, we need to start articulating our case and presenting our case to the state and demanding what should have been ours all along. In terms of services, we deliver an advice service, a drugs programme, a music technology project, and in terms of advocacy, we have a political affairs programme. We have a Dukas project which collects the stories of people who have been living through this conflict from various perspectives. And we do a lot of lobbying around political issues, human rights issues, equality issues, and a major part of the work that I'm involved in is conflict resolution. We have what we call here interfaces, and that's areas where people live sort of cheek by jowl, two communities live very, very close to each other. So the first key issue that they want addressed is safety, because no one that I know living on an interface wants trouble at their doorstep. So we would do a lot of work around that there. We put local communities in contact with each other. We use things like mobile phone networks, where if there's trouble, people can phone each other and they know who's on the other end of the phone. And that creates a wee bit of confidence within the communities. It's very easy to make peace with your friends and to talk to your friends. It's much harder to talk to your enemy or to try and find common ground with your enemy. You know, as a Republican, if I talk to a loyalist, I'm not coming in on a white charger to try and convince them that loyalism's wrong and they've no right to believe what they have. But certainly what I can do is give them my experience of what Republicanism is about and why I'm a Republican. But it's also very, very important that I hear why they're a loyalist, what has made them a loyalist, what loyalism means to them. And that's not anything that should threaten me. In Belfast, we have high levels of deprivation, social deprivation, but also things like educational deprivation. Now, that doesn't know any religious boundaries or any political affiliations. And what we have found in general is that in working class communities, and this would be the same the world over, I mean, it's not particular to Belfast, but because of the religious divide in Belfast, you know, we haven't united to overcome that. And what we're trying to do here in West Belfast is look at those common issues and try and find common solutions. The second thing we're looking to do is relationship building, and that's where people don't have to agree politically, and they maybe never will agree politically, but what they will agree is that they'll talk about the things that divide them, but they'll not resort to violence, and that has to be good for us all. We're moving forward, sometimes slowly, and sometimes something happens politically that interferes with the work that happens on the ground. But the good thing is that we can come back, dust ourselves down, pick it up again, and hopefully we'll build good, solid, strong relationships. Well, there are clearly two processes, well, at least two processes going on here. There's the peace process, and that's really, you know, removing violence from the equation. But I firmly believe that without the political process to back that up, the peace process will flounder somewhere down the line. I think we need to deal with the core political issues to cement the work that's being done to bring peace about in the country. And I think the political process, I think we're at coming near the end game for parties to make up their mind. I mean, the people are wanting it. The people on the street know the value in getting the political process up and running. They know the value in getting the institutions up and running. British rule ministers here are administering British rule very, very badly in terms of the people and the deal that the people are getting. They're introducing systems here on water rates, different taxation issues that are totally anti what the whole of the people in the north of Ireland even want. The political parties know they're doing it, but the only way that they can stop it is by getting the institutions up and running, and I think that's really what we need to do. Belfast is a very, very divided city, and what we need to be doing is to work on the overcome and create a vision of Belfast as one city, where we become Belfast people as opposed to what most people would describe themselves now. So they would say, well, I'm a West Belfast person, or an East Belfast person, or a Shankill Road person, and I think we need to try and create a vision of Belfast. And I think that will lead us on to bigger things, because, you know, Belfast is the biggest city in the north and one of the biggest cities in the whole country. And if we can create that vision where people are buying into one Belfast, then we've moved an awful lot forward. I also think that we need to create, you know, economic benefits for our people, because what's politics really about if it's not about creating better conditions for the people that live in the country? And I also think that our children deserve much better out of life, and what we need to be doing is creating the conditions whereby they can flourish and they can develop and be the best that they can be. And I think things like, you know, our education system need looked at, our health system needs looked at. These have been areas of massive neglect in the past because the focus has been on security. None of us here are innocent of what has happened in this country, you know. And I think we all have to accept responsibility for what has happened. Now, I think if we do that and we want to move forward, I think we'll find plenty of people who want to move forward with us. This is a small island. When we're talking about as Republicans a united Ireland, it has to be an Ireland that unites people. So the country is about people. And when we talk about a united Ireland or a new Ireland, that in my eyes includes loyalism and includes Protestants, and includes people who consider themselves British. So if we're talking about building a new Ireland that includes and is all inclusive, well, surely there's an onus on us to learn about it, and to learn what makes a British person feel they're British who lives in Ireland, or a loyalist, or a Protestant who has a different outlook on politics. And I think that's challenging for us, but I also think it makes us be better people.
I was there at the first meeting, and it's hard to explain to anybody who wasn't there. The table was probably 30 foot long, and we had to use microphones to speak to each other.
Sat miles away. We couldn't even make each other's faces out.
After the official part of the meeting, we started talking out in the hall and got to know each other.
The relationships had built, and now they're excellent.
In terms of the network, I like the mix. There's community activists, there's youth activists, there's MAS, there's wee women, wee men.
I feel that I'm doing something for my community. I think it's important to have contact across the wall.
It's because I want a peaceful future for my children and their children. And I realise that the trouble at the interfaces can destabilise the peace process.
Interaction Belfast is a network of community activists who work on both sides of the Springfield Falls Shankill interface in West Belfast. Also known as a peace wall, the interface is a 4-mile-long, 25-foot-high steel wall that serves to separate the Catholic nationalist community from the Protestant unionist community. But while the wall does separate the two communities, it also invites conflict. When tensions are running high, members from both communities may be drawn to the interface as a place to vent frustrations and act out their anger. Roisin McGlone has over 20 years' experience as a community worker and is the current director of Interaction Belfast. In 1998, Roisin played a key role in creating and implementing the groundbreaking mobile phone network. This project has been highly successful in reducing violence along the interface and has allowed activists from both sides of the wall to build relationships while discussing issues of common concern. We will now hear from Roisin McGlone as she explains why relationship building is a necessary element of conflict resolution and why she believes the mobile phone network has been such a success.
This is an organisation which was founded in 1988. And it's a branch of, basically it's about civil society and it's about empowerment for people in communities. We work on an interface area, which there's violence on a regular basis. And we've set up all sorts of mechanisms to get people engaged in dialogue. I suppose the simplest way to explain this is that we facilitate very difficult conversations. Mm-hmm. And those conversations can sometimes be between adults, sometimes it can be between communities, and sometimes it can be between organisations and communities. We've lots of fractures across our relationships, and the troubles, as people euphemistically refer to it, has been going on for 35 years. And there's lots of people, there's been approximately more than 3,000 people killed, and in this area alone, 1/3 of all Troubles-related deaths are in this area. So there's lots of suspicion, mistrust, and bigotry and hatred. And what we've been doing for the last 18 years, this organisation, is to build mechanisms where people can start to build that trust again and can start to have those very difficult conversations. Because as we move out of a violent conflict into a non-violent conflict, the conflict is still there. People are still unionists, they're still nationalists, and so they should be, and their political aspirations are important. But we can have discourse. It isn't about wanting to shoot each other or throw stones at one another. It's fairly prehistoric, but you know, children that still do throw stones at one another across a wall. So I suppose my interest lies in this whole issue of trust building and what it takes. And I work with an international facilitator called Brian Curran, who's from South Africa and went through the whole South African process, and he works as a consultant to this project. And it's not just simply inter-community work. I mean, it's not about making the two tribes nicer to one another. It's about a fundamental in transitional justice, and it's about perpetrators and the victims and the bystanders. And it's about trying to get past that stage and also looking at dealing with the trauma. But it's much more deep than just getting people to be nice to one another. It's fundamentally trying to transform relationships. So many people have already gone through this. Why reinvent the wheel? You know, the reality is that the issues that come out of violent conflict, irrespective of whether it's in the Soviet bloc or whether it's in Latin America or whether it's in Rwanda or whether it's in South Africa, they're the same issues. Truth recovery, for example, is a big issue. The example, things like what happens about amnesties, what happens about people who violated human rights on both sides, and what happens to victims, what happens to victims' families. When a war is over, one of the things that people do want is to recover the truth. What is the truth of what happened? And when we go through that trauma, we have our own take on what that is. So everyone wants their form of truth, and I think the difficulty that we have is that we need to get some generalised truth. But that's not always possible. People want to know what happened to their loved ones. They want to know why they died. They want to know why there was or wasn't a proper investigation. And in some ways, people want to know the motivation as well. What motivated the perpetrators, the people who committed the crimes, to do what they did. We decided to take stock, and we did a community inquiry. And we went out for about a year. We got a few prominent people in different fields and went out and listened to people's stories. So we decided that there was lots of people in the community that wanted to do something, but they didn't know how to. They didn't have a mechanism to contact. The other big thing that we found out, that rumour played a great part in the violence. There would be rumours that a community was going to be attacked, and they would come out to defend themselves, when in fact they weren't going to be attacked. And there was no networks, there was no ways that people could communicate. Well, myself and a couple of my colleagues come up with this idea, well, what if we were to get a network, a tree of phone numbers where people could phone each other? And at that stage people were saying that's a no-go, or they still didn't trust each other enough to give them their home number, for example, and most of the violence happened at night. And the other thing they said to us as well, we're not even in home at night, we're out there on the street trying to do what we can. But one of the difficulties is if you're out in an interface, for example, and you're trying to stop your community, and you can't give them any evidence that there's anyone trying to do the same on the other side, your community would see you as betraying them, because you should be supporting them to defend the community. So we then come up with this idea. Mobile phones weren't a big thing then in '98, believe it or not, here. And we rang all the mobile phone companies and asked would they sponsor, giving us some phones that we could give to key community activists in the different communities. Anyway, the thing developed, and we eventually lobbied, even though we didn't have an assembly, we lobbied our local politicians, and we got the government to give us some money. And what we did was we asked each community to nominate a person, and that person, the phone would be manned or womaned 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it would be there for checking out rumours. Now, it had a very bumpy start. People didn't trust one another, and people turned phones off and whatever. But from that, what we've developed, and what we have is we've 27 phone holders in 27 different communities along the interface, and they're on call 24/7, completely voluntary. I remember thinking to myself, the phones are just the technology. The people behind the phones are important. And I remember when I said to people, I'm going to bring all the phone holders together, and they said, oh, you're going to bring the Catholics and the Protestants or the Unionists and the Nationalists. And I said, no, I'm going to bring them all together. And they said, you're mad. you know. And we had a meeting down in the City Hall in one of the committee rooms where people spoke to one another by putting on microphones. And all the nationalists were at one end of the room and one of the unionists, all the unionists at the other. Those people now meet in here every second Friday. They're great friends, great relationships have been built. They still go out there and do the work on the ground, but they sit here and they talk about those contentious issues. And they're key community leaders. It's about Indigenous leadership with integrity, and it's about we find people with integrity and we try to support them. They usually have standing in their own community anyway, and we basically, we don't ask people to come along and do anything. We share a vision, and what we do is we try to inspire people with a vision of what it could be like, and that frees people up then to find their own way towards that, and everyone knows what we do, so you don't come along and get involved in this project if you want to maintain sectarian lines. You only come along and get involved if you believe in the vision. And I think we've been successful in inspiring people to that vision, and people that may be great people in their own communities, but maybe without this project they would never have met each other. And so we're that bridge, we're that link. We just provide a safe place for people to come and discuss, bring their politics into the room with them and discuss issues. I feel very fortunate that in my country, in a time of transition, that I'm actually in a position where I can influence some of these issues. I mean, I feel I just feel it's a gift that I've been given. And people often say to me, you know, I've been in the middle of riots and I've been in the middle of very difficult situations on a regular basis, and they'll say, how do you do it? And I just think, well, I wouldn't want to be doing anything else.
Billy McQuiston is a Loyalist ex-combatant who served 12.5 years in prison for his involvement with the Loyalist paramilitary group, the Ulster Defence Association. While in prison, Billy listened to his fellow inmates as they spoke about what it was like to be denied civil rights and live in a unionist-controlled society. He left prison still a Loyalist, but with an open mind and a new perspective on the conflict. Shortly after his release from Longkesh, Billy began working as a community development activist. He now works alongside Roisin McGlone at Interaction Belfast and has played an instrumental role in bringing unionists into the mobile phone network. We will now hear from Billy McQuiston as he describes his transformation from combatant to peacemaker and discusses the important role that ex-combatants play in the peace process.
Well, basically I served 12.5 years in prison for the Ulster Defence Association. I'm an ex-Loyalist prisoner. And on my release from prison, I got involved in community development, community work in and around the area. We formed a group called Prisoners in Partnership, which is ex-UDA prisoners, and in partnership with the community. We felt that it was incumbent upon us to help the community because they had helped us through 30 years of troubles. And because the area is an interface area and it borders on three sides with a nationalist area, very early on in the proceedings of developing the community, we kept coming up against the interface. During the war, we fought for our people, and now that that war is over, we're still fighting for our people, but on a different stage. So, I mean, I have found that ex-combatants are the biggest driving force for peace in and around this country. I mean, I left school at 15. I didn't have no formal education, but I was educated in prison. I availed myself of the education that was available in prison, and I became more politically aware. And I have to stress to you, you know, I mean, as well as serving 12.5 years in prison, there were several attempts made on my life, and it was hard. It was very hard for me at the beginning to come in and sit down at the other side of the table from people who I know may well have been involved in those attempts on my life, and who had been involved in the murder of friends and family of mine. It was very hard at the start. But when we sat down and we started getting involved with stuff together, we built up a relationship there, and in having dialogue with each other, I came to realise that the only difference between us was where we were born. And when we talked to some of the youth there, we have ex-combatants there from each side that we go and talk to youth and explain our past and what we see for the future. And I tell them all the time that the only difference between me and that guy sitting beside me is where we were born. Because I have no doubt in my mind that if I was born where he was born, that I would do what he'd done. And if he'd been born where I was born, he'd have done what I'd done. People say to me about some of the things that we did in the past. And I think that the way I explain that to people is that we done extraordinary things to each other, but we lived in extraordinary times. They were normal for us. And I can say, from my own point of view, that adapting to normality was a long process and a hard process. I found it very hard in that transition because basically for 30 odd years we had lived on adrenaline, and it was hard to learn to settle down and to listen to other people's point of view, because during a war you have to demonise your enemy. And it was a process for me over a number of years. I mean, I've been involved in this now for 8 years, and it was a process. I mean, the first 3 years were a transitional period for me in learning. When I came out of prison, I guess I went home, and basically I went home to my own area, Highfield, and basically it's a loyalist area, 100% loyalist, and in that area where I come from, I come from what we termed as a Greater Shankill area. 5,000 people in that area served time in prison during the conflict. 374 people were murdered during the conflict in that area. So it's a very hard-line, loyalist area. But I think my time in prison, during my time in prison, I was in prison when Republican prisoners were there. So I was listening to their debates and their arguments, and it sort of came around a bit. I mean, it just broadened my horizons. But I think the thing that helped us change mostly was dialogue with Republicans, because, you know, it doesn't make me less of a loyalist to engage in dialogue with Republicans, and it doesn't lessen their republicanism to engage in dialogue with me. But through dialogue, we can realise that we both have similar problems, and if we work together, then we can work on those problems far better than we could working on them individually. We have a programme where we go into schools and we would tell young people now that the war and militarism is not the way forward. If you want to help your community now and you want to fight for your community, it has moved on to a new stage. It has moved to politics and community development. So if you want to help your community, then get a good education and get involved in politics or get involved in community development. So, and as well as that, we do cross-cultural stuff with kids from both sides of the interface, where we are teaching them that it's quite legitimate to have a different culture, and it's quite legitimate to have a different point of view, and you don't have to try and enforce that at the point of a gun.
This is Indie Media on Air on KPFK, 90.7 FM Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara.
Harry Smith and Stefan Long are both residents of Finagee in South Belfast. Harry is a unionist and Stefan is a nationalist, and their neighbourhoods interface at the crossroads. Concerned that occasional sectarian violence at the crossroads would expand into a full-blown conflict between communities, Harry and Stefan agreed that intervention was necessary. Together they formed Finagee Crossroads Group and have been providing support services and leadership to both communities for the past 14 years. We will now hear from Harry Smith and Stefan Long as they discuss their plans for an integrated Finagee Crossroads.
My name's Harry Smith. I've been a resident of Finagee, this area, all my life. I spent 8 years in Belfast City Council as a councillor with the Democratic Unionist Party. I'm currently a community worker in this area, and I'm also a member of the Belfast District Policing Partnership.
I'm Stefan Long. I'm a community activist within the Finagee area. I've been active in Republican politics for near 20 years now. I'm the Sinn Féin representative for the area. Co-chair of Finagee Crossroads Group with Harry.
Yeah. I suppose we can go back maybe 14 years, 10 to 14 years, whenever I was an active member of Belfast City Council. And this is predominantly a loyalist area, and always has been. And we border with a nationalist stroke Republican area, specifically known as Finicky Crossroads. And really, 14 years ago, I began talking with Stefan in relation to the future of Finicky Crossroads, because we were becoming concerned at that time that there was every possibility that the Crossroads could become a fully fledged interface, sectarian interface. And at the time, there were a number of sectarian related incidents involving attacks on both communities. And we felt that as responsible adults, and certainly local residents, we hoped that we could develop a relationship between both communities in order that we may look seriously at ensuring that Finicky Crossroads remained as shared space as possible.
I think Harry's right. I mean, Finicky wouldn't be a traditional interface in the sense that there's no boundary, there's no walls, but Finicky Crossroads became the focal point for inter-community conflict and antisocial behaviour where the two communities met. And it's unique in a way because it's a relatively affluent or middle class nationalist area that interfaces with a working class unionist or loyalist area, and that makes it fairly unique in Belfast terms. We were concerned about many years ago that the level of sectarianism actually would have gave way, and that a genuine or an interface would have had to be built, some type of wall or some type of boundary. And it's a terrible indictment upon us that there would be viewed as two separate communities. There has been very, very little interaction between those two communities in the last 30 years.
And our children have grown up in a segregated state. You know, they don't go to school together.
We don't work together, we don't shop together, we don't socialise together. Our children don't play together. And as I said, it's a terrible indictment upon us as community leaders that we've allowed that to happen. But that is a byproduct of the conflict.
And that's something perhaps in our time that we will never break down. But certainly from the perspective of children on this side in Finicky, you know, they have this, it's like a tick in their mind where they will not cross the Finicky Crossroads into which would be seen as predominantly Republican nationalist West Belfast. They just won't do that. We have in the area an integrated school, and we know of examples where children from both communities who do go to school together actually arrange to meet in areas like Finicky Crossroads to have a go at one another and to throw stones at each other. So it's very, very difficult. From Stefan and I's perspective, we've been working together now for close on 14 years, and we do trust and we do have a certain amount of confidence in each other. But our young people, you know, goodness knows how many years we're going to have to work with them in order to break down the sectarian barriers that still exist in their minds today.
What has been most beneficial is that we have continued to talk and we have continued to meet and show leadership within our communities. At times that have been particularly tense throughout the rest of Belfast, at times when there has been violence throughout the rest of Belfast, our community group has continued to meet and has continued to show that leadership. Physically on the ground. So for example, if there was trouble, Harry, myself and other individuals would be down on the interface, working with our communities, working with our young people, letting them know that we didn't want the trouble to happen in this area. We've done single identity issue work with our young people, as in teaching them about their own culture, about their own background, about their own tradition, and about how important it was to respect your own tradition, but at the same time you didn't need to denigrate anybody else's tradition to respect your own.
From my side of the perspective in loyalism, young people within loyalist areas really aren't aware of any history at all associated with Northern Ireland, and they look at things like flags and emblems being representative of their history. They also have very little understanding of the Republican nationalist ethos. So we're trying to show them that yes, there is a story behind republicanism and nationalism, but importantly, and this is important, there's also a story behind their own tradition. Like children in my area aren't taught local Irish history. They're taught English history that's taught to school kids in England. You know, and that just has left a huge void and gap with my young people who really don't know where they belong. And to many of them, the history of Northern Ireland is nothing more than being part of paramilitarism, the Ulster Defence Association, the Ulster Volunteer Force. So we've spent a significant time in our community sort of encouraging young people to look beyond the shadows of paramilitaries and to look at their real history and where they come from. And I have to say, that alone has had a major impact on young people in this area. We've really achieved a significant change in the mindset of not just young people, but also adults. And I have to say, Stefan wouldn't be sitting here 2 years ago.
No.
And I certainly wouldn't be going up into West Belfast to meet with Stefan 2 years ago. Because people today in my community still won't, if you like, cross a road into a Republican area through fear. So it's breaking that down, but I think we're getting there.
If Harry was to come and cross the road and go into West Belfast, what would happen? Probably nothing. If I was to come into this area and walk around this area, what would happen? Probably nothing. You know, I mean, but there's that misperception out there that, you know, people can tell how you are, and unfortunately, it's a reality in the north that, you know, when there's no peace wall or there's no line on the ground that delineates Nationalist West Belfast and Unionist South Belfast, the side of the road that you walk on, the school uniform that you wear, where you shop and where you work, all are potential indicators of either your religion or your political creed.
We could rap on 10, 20, 30 doors, and you could ask those residents, you know, have you ever shopped on the Andersonstown Road? Or have you ever shopped on the Falls Road? Not one of them would tell you that they have, because of that perception of fear, and because of the, if you like, the way the conflict stage managed us all. You know, we just couldn't do that. So that's the key for us in Finaghy, is breaking down that barrier and making people feel comfortable that they can walk up into West Belfast and shop in the Andersonstown Road, wherever they like, because the attitude of people up there is no different from the attitude of people down here.
We do need a return to the evolved institutions, we do need joined up government, and we do need combating sectarianism and segregation to be made a government priority.
And this can't be underestimated.
You know, we need to be employing people to actually go out on the ground and do this type of work.
We see a future in devolved government. Our politicians are playing in politics at the moment, and we need to really begin to hold them to account. We want local politicians taking local decisions. We just want our own future being mapped out for us by our own people. Really, you know, there are other people within our society today who aren't too keen on what we do. And unfortunately that can be, you know, you can find elements of that right up the very top of the political process today. But the reality for us is putting Loyalists and Republicans together to look at their families, to look at the areas they live in, and to look more importantly into the future has been a huge success to us. And the beauty of getting Stormont up and going is that politicians will have to sit down together and will have to take real decisions on the future of real people.
On March 7, 2007, the citizens of Northern Ireland elected 108 Assembly members to represent them in the Stormont Assembly. On Monday, March 26th, Ian Paisley of the Democratic Unionist Party is expected to be sworn in as First Minister, with Martin McGuinness of Sinn Féin serving as Deputy First Minister. But it is uncertain whether this historic attempt to establish a power-sharing government in Northern Ireland will succeed. Ian Paisley has not yet agreed to participate in power-sharing with members of Sinn Féin, and negotiations are underway in an attempt to reach an agreement. The British and Irish governments insist that the deadline is firm and that if the Assembly does not convene on March 26th, it will be dissolved and direct rule will continue. Join us next week for Indie Media On Air as we look at the outcome of the day's events in the Stormont Assembly and continue our discussion on peace and politics in Northern Ireland.